Was that. Okay, so let's welcome our speaker, James Bratt.
Thank you. And it's good to be back. I really enjoyed teaching here last spring, I guess. Did a thing on Alexis de Tocqueville and his vision of America. So yeah, I'm a U.S. historian, or a historian of the United States, but also of the colonies that would become the United States. So this part of, I'm teaching this as a four-term sequence at Calvin's equivalent program, CALL. And this one goes up to the eve of the American Revolution. So we have to put ourselves in mind of the time when nobody knew that America was going to become an independent country. In fact, pretty much up to the end date of this course, 1760, most white people who lived in what would become the United States were very, very proud and very adamant that they were British. They're very proud of being British. America, or American, started out as kind of a slur that British troops during the French and Indian War referred to the natives as the colonists were insisting that they were British. No, you're not British, you're American. So it's a very different time, different assumptions, and religion is one way to get into this different time. So yeah, without further ado, oh, by the way, my wife and I were visiting our kids in Shanghai for a month. We arrived back, I think it was Thursday. I'm not sure what time zone I'm in. So if I just sort of fade away up here, it's, you know, just lay me out and make sure I'm comfy and I'll wake up. But yeah, you know, the energy level comes and goes. So here we go. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the setting of colonial America, the geography, the demography, political, cultural systems, and so forth. And then we're going to go to the first topic. Well, what should the first topic be? When you think of religion in colonial America, what images come to mind? Puritans, okay? Quakers, okay. Art thou one of them? Oh, good. Yeah, very good. I'm sorry? Native Americans with their own religious systems, yeah. Episcopalian RCA. Well, we're boxing the compass here. Now, the first answer is the standard American one, right? Early America is Puritans. I mean, Thanksgiving Day's coming up, right? The town meeting, Plymouth Rock, Harvard, and the improvement on Harvard called Yale, where I got my doctorate. Okay, so we'll be visiting the New Haven Green in a minute. So many of our images and impressions of early America are rooted in New England and Puritanism. And that was kind of the standard narrative in American history writing until like the 1950s and 1960s. Since then, historians have made a very good case that the Puritans in New England were very much the exception to what was the standard way of life and the standard set of aspirations on this shore. So we're going to be talking about the Puritans next time. They are a very strong example of early American religion, but not the typical one. We're going to talk today about the default position, which is Anglican, later Episcopalian. That's the default option. And then Puritans next week. Then we'll get to the Quakers and the Dutch Reformed and the motley crew that hung out in what we call the Middle Colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey. Then we'll talk about the wild, crazy people in the backcountry, the Appalachians, the Scots-Irish. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with talking about the birth of evangelicalism It's born in the late 1730s as part of a revival, a transatlantic revival with the Wesley brothers and George in Britain, Jonathan Edwards, Gilbert Tennant, Theodore Frelinghuysen to go RCA in the colonies, and George Whitefield, who thought he was St. Paul, took missionary journeys from London to the New World. Only he did St. Paul a couple better. He took 6, not 4 missionary journeys. So that's the so-called Great Awakening, and that will be our 5th session. Okay, so before we get into Anglicans, let's talk about the setting and the demography and so forth. And when we look at this map, we see how perilous and marginal in enterprise these colonial settlements were. I use the laser pointer. Which screen should I point at for folks at home? This one? Okay. Much of early American literature describes the setting as a howling wilderness. And when you look at the map from this perspective, indeed it was. We have a few settlements along the shore. These purple ones are English. You can see that, relatively speaking, New England is heavily, relatively speaking, heavily populated. This is a 1650. We have settlements, largely tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake area. We have threatening Spanish possessions down here. The Dutch are clustered around New Amsterdam, with a few up at Fort Orange, later Albany. And here is New France. You can see it there, big as life, Quebec, right? So this is a very underpopulated, very marginal situation. The orientation was not into the interior. None of these people were thinking about the American future that they were here to build. Their orientation was back across the Atlantic the other way to the home country. Okay? And put things in relative terms, all the people gathered here, settled here, all the English and Dutch colonists, for that matter, in 1650, were outnumbered by the population on one Caribbean island, Barbados. Barbados was 15 miles by 11 miles. It had more people than this whole coast. And it was much more valuable economically. Barbados was a sugar island, and sugar was the white powder that came out of the Caribbean that commanded any price and almost unlimited demand. Crucially, it required bonded labor, and that quickly became African enslaved labor. So Barbados, the Caribbean islands, are the crown jewels of everybody's empire. The most valuable place in colonial America was Haiti, a French sugar island. Haiti, of course, today is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So yeah, a lot of our expectations are sort of turned over. There are, someone mentioned Native people, so they were crucial, and there are all kinds of different tribes clustered in the backcountry. Purple here is for New Netherland. Yellow is English. Again, orange is Spanish, and this is New France, the green part along the Great Lakes chain and St. Lawrence. We talk about colonial America in terms of regions. New England up here, then the so-called Middle Colonies or the Middle Atlantic, New York with the periphery of Vermont, originally a New York claim, Pennsylvania, the geographical expression called New Jersey, also known as the suburbs of New York and Philadelphia. And New Jersey remains that character today, right? ask someone in New Jersey where they're from, and they give you an exit off the turnpike. This is really strong identity, huh? Anyway, some of my best friends are from Jersey, so I won't disparage them anymore. This is the Upper South, or the Chesapeake, settled fairly early. This is the Lower South, the Carolinas and Georgia, settled fairly late, based upon, and it was settled first, the pioneer settlers there were immigrants, younger sons from Barbados. Okay, and then the backcountry along the Appalachian chain coming in, in the 1720s, 30s, but really burgeoning right up to the eve of the American Revolution. So just a little geographical lingo that I'm going to be tossing out. I hope if you forget what's what, please let me know. In terms of colonial population, you can see how marginal and thin an enterprise this is till fairly late in the game. It's after the wars with France are over in 1715, Louis XIV finally dies and gets out of the way, the population really takes off. But for a long, long time, the population is, well, let's see, at 1720, it's less than 200,000. That's all the British colonies on the mainland. So we're talking about sparsely populated, geographically marginal, fairly isolated groups. But once things take off, they really take off. This population growth is obvious to the British rulers back home, and that's when they finally get interested in the value of these colonies, and that's when the laws that trigger the American Revolution get to be imposed and enforced. Oh, yeah. So the population really takes off, particularly noticed in the Upper South, Virginia and Maryland. New England is the red line, and we think it's most important. It's tied with the Chesapeake area till about the 1720s and then gets left behind. Middle colonies are settled fairly later. They catch up with New England right at the time of the American Revolution. New England is kind of a fading region by the time of the American Revolution. And then the Lower South is gets its growth very late as well, and it's tied with the growth of the enslaved population. So this is the African American population from the start until 1780. Notice how low this is. It's only around the 1670s that the British create the Royal Africa Company to get their own supply of enslaved labor from Africa, that the enslaved labor population really takes off. But once it does, it soars. This is a curve, a growth curve, very unlike the enslaved population in the rest of the hemisphere, because on most of the sugar colonies, you did not have natural increase. The labor was so intensive that people died within 5 or 6 years. It's in the Chesapeake around 1730s that we have an exception to that rule, and the African American population starts showing natural increase. In the Lower South, that happens about the time of the American Revolution. So just in relative terms, 5% of the slave labor imported from Africa, 5% came to the future United States. But by the time of the War of 1812, 50% of the people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere lived in the United States. And that's, so it's like the miracle of compound interest, right? We're mostly retired and we live on that miracle. We live materially on that miracle. We live spiritually on other miracles, I know, but compound interest, well, compound interest works in birth rates as well and has a great demographic effect. Ethnic distribution. So the lavender here is English. New England was maybe more English than even England, because by the time of the American Revolution, because England had a lot of people coming over from Ireland and Scotland and so forth. After the Great Migration of the Puritans ended around 1640, nobody else came until the Irish immigration 200 years later. Okay, so this is a very ethnically monoculture here in New England. But then, you know, the lavender English predominance around here. The dark gray is African American, these African American pockets. Red is for German. That develops only after the 1730s or so. Here in the backcountry, the intermediate country of the Middle Colonies and Upper Virginia, also along the Mohawk. The Dutch are up and down the Hudson and into Jersey, and the Scots-Irish back here. Okay, so the religious map tends to replicate that to some extent. We have Congregational Church, Puritan Church heavy in New England. The default option, as I said, is Anglicanism. That's the pale green. We have Dutch Reformed along here. This is what makes the Middle Colonies the most interesting place to study early American religion. This is a patchwork quilt of diversities. And then here we have the pesky Baptists. That's the fruit of the Great Awakening, the kind of the spearhead of evangelicalism. So background to demographics, religious distribution, and so forth. Any questions right now on any of this? This is a lot of general background really quickly, but the title of the course is Plurality. Puritans are very strong. They are not all that numerous compared to the rest of the country, but they are very strong and unified. They make a bold statement. And the strength of that statement tends to, in our memory, tends to overshadow the great diversity that's on scene here. Any questions about, yeah.
I was just wondering, are the Amish considered a separate group from those up there?
The
Where would they
Amish
fit
and
in?
Mennonites are right into the stick here. Yeah, they're not, they're very strong in southern southeastern Pennsylvania, yeah.
Mhm.
So maybe they're looked at, they're really Anabaptists. This
Okay.
map might be treating them as Baptists. They're also German, but yeah, that's right in here and down the Shenandoah Valley.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah.
It's interesting that Baptist is separate from Presbyterian, or when I first glanced at this, it looked like you were considering Baptist, Roman Catholics, and Jewish as a type of Presbyterian, which you could almost say might be sort of true in a way, but but that those are separate but minor groups. They're not predominant. So Baptists are not predominant till later. Or if at all.
Baptists become the house religion of the South, but that happens much later. With the Great Awakening, that's in the 1740s and 50s, that's when the Baptists really take off. You'll notice that there are no Methodists on this map. By the 1820s, the Methodists are the largest denomination in the United States. So you have this explosion of evangelical churches, particularly Baptists and Methodists, beginning in the 1740s and 50s, and soaring for the next 75 years. They're the great growth industry. And they're particularly heavy in the backcountry and in the South. So this is in 1760. By 1830, this map will look radically different. So the Great Awakening had tremendous impact on both numbers and distribution. Okay, excuse me, to Anglicanism. I found this, I don't remember where I found this quote, but an Anglican, later perhaps an Episcopal rector, described what should happen on Sunday morning as sober delight and rational exaltation. Now, Baptist brothers and sisters have a different sort of exaltation. Do you want sanctification? Bam. No, that's Pentecostal. That's that's later. Anglicanism is set and formal, which for many people is a cuss word. You don't want formality in religion. Episcopalians love formality in religion. You don't know that the service has started. The service may not start until the proper form is recited. Collect for purity, Almighty God, to you all hearts are open, all desires known, and from you no secrets are hid. Cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Now we can have church. Before we get to that, why, how Episcopalianism or Anglicanism, it becomes Episcopalian after the Revolution, right? You don't want your church in the newly independent United States to have Anglo in the name, the Church of England. So the background, Anglicanism has a rocky start and a rocky course for this first 100 years. And that's why they are so set upon order and proper form. It begins with Henry VIII, his not so pious desire to have a male heir. He kept on running through lives, not knowing that it was his job to contribute the Y chromosome. Think of this, the guy blamed the woman, okay? So he insists on a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, from Spain, the greatest power in the world at the time. And he separates from Rome ecclesiastically, but not much doctrinally. So he's a nominal Protestant, but his one surviving son, Edward VI, is raised under Protestant tutors, particularly Thomas Cranmer, and he's a genuine Protestant, and he wants to promote the cause. In the inscrutable providence of God, he is weak and dies young, and he's replaced by his oldest sister, by Henry's first wife, the arch-Catholic Catherine of Aragon. And this Mary I, kindly known in Protestant lore as Bloody Mary, right? That's how you learned about her, tries to re-Catholicize the country. She is kind of sickly as well and dies soon. And finally, we get to the ablest politician of the 16th century, perhaps in all of Europe. Elizabeth I was a long and very successful reign. And she reverts to Anglicanism as a via media, a middle way between the Puritans, the ultra-Protestant party in the Anglican Church that wants to push more Reformation forward, and the Catholic sentiment that wants to go back to the old days. With all these arguments going on, Elizabeth says, I don't care what you believe can believe what you want, but we all have to worship the same way. And so she prescribes the Book of Common Prayer, the liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer will be the thing that keeps the Church of England together. When she dies, the Puritan party has not been extinguished. They rally under the new House of Stuart. Elizabeth dies without an heir, of course, so we bring in her cousins, the Stuarts. James I, although he gives us the King James Bible, which many people, or some people, take to be divinely inspired in its translation. There are some King James only folks, maybe you know some. Otherwise, he resists further reform. His brother, Charles I, is a crypto-Catholic. Elizabeth and James have allowed some latitude, some variation in what you believe and so forth. but Charles I cracks down. He reduces the level of tolerance in the church, and it's here under him that the Puritans in 1629, 1630 set out on their great expedition to New England. His fiscal and military policy eventually ignite a civil war. He is overthrown and beheaded. This is not like assassinating a president in the United States. This is like tearing up the Constitution, okay? This is a real revolution, the Puritan Revolution, often equated with the English Civil War. So then we have the Commonwealth with a strong Puritan strain to it for the course of the 1650s. Under the leadership of the Lord Protector, he's not a king, he's the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, that goes south, and the monarchy is restored in 1660 with Charles II. His brother takes over, James II, in 1685, another crypto-Catholic, tries to push a return to Catholicism, at which time a Dutchman invades England, William of Orange. His wife is James's daughter, but they think it's time for dear old dad to leave the scene. So this is the glorious revolution. James II is not executed. He's simply sent into exile. And we have the reign of William III, William of Orange, William III, and Mary. And finally, things settle down, and the Anglican establishment can get its legs under it and be stable. And the way to achieve stability is to revert to Elizabeth's formula. We all worship the same way. We don't allow people to come up with their own ideas and their own innovations. Innovation is kind of a bad thing because it leads to disorder, it leads to war, and leads to revolution and then counter-revolution. We don't want any more of that mess. We want stability. And we find stability in common worship. The Book of Common Prayer, under the original editorship of Thomas Cranmer. There is in here, ladies and gentlemen, a prayer for each and every occasion. There's a particular prayer called the Collect for every Sunday as you go through the liturgical year. And that's how you organize worship, by the liturgical year, beginning with Advent, proceeding through Epiphany, Lent, Easter, and then the green season, yeah? Ordinary time. What? Should there be ordinary time before God? Should not all our time be dedicated to God? This is the Puritan voice now. This is the Calvinists. Should not all our time be devoted to God? And should not our hearts pray rather than just our lips? So when evangelicals come around, they throw this out, as the Puritans had, many of them, because only a spontaneous prayer that comes from your own heart right now can be authentic prayer, can be sincere, and count for something in the eyes of God. Spontaneous prayer, say the Anglicans, will be wandering, will be idiosyncratic, will reflect the fads of the day. It's much better to pray the wisdom, the collected wisdom of the church over time, expressed in great English. And this book is great, great English. So on the evangelical end, we're looking ahead at the Great Awakening now. At the evangelical end, it's the sincere individual with spontaneous feelings and utterance. But how do you know you're sincere? How do you know you're sincerely sincere? Then you go down the rabbit hole of self-doubt, huh? No need for self-doubt here. You pray the prescription and the Lord will hear it. And brothers and sisters in the evangelical mode, I'm here to testify that this works. Because a lot of times we don't have it, sincerity and ardent, heartfelt desire before the Lord when we come to church. This teaches us when we cannot speak, this speaks for us. And as we speak the words, we are instructed and we are uplifted. So my parents did not like mere ritual. Ritual is always mere, right? Not mere ritual, sincerity. I've given up sincerity long ago because I can't find it. I'm never sure of it. And this is by far away my preference. Anyway, so we have the zigging and zagging down over time. Formal worship is true worship. It's wise worship. It's upbuilding worship. It's edifying worship. It builds the soul. It builds the character with customary usage over time. And as the cycle of the liturgical year comes around, you hear the same prayers again a year later, and another year later, and 30 years later. And you have all those memories, and you have that familiarity, and it's a spiritual experience. Okay. This is also very sort of religion oriented towards sacramentality. Again, in Puritan and evangelical worship, the sermon is the thing. The sermon is the thing. And if you're CRC or RCA in background, you know the custom of Sunday dinner, whatever beef roast or chicken dish, whatever's being served, the main dish is roast domini, right? You critique the sermon because that's what worship was about. In Episcopal Church, you might get a good sermon. It won't be a sermon, it'll be a homily, or you might not. But that's not the point, because the point of worship is the sacrament, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, which comes after the homily is over. Now we go up and receive the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. The sacrament is the thing. And how do we come into the church? Not by some born-again experience. We come into the church by baptism. So baptism, reception of the Lord's Supper at the communion rail, kneeling before a priest. Ooh, sounds Catholic to me. Again, these early engravings of colonial Americans gathered at the communion rail. This is the point of service. It's the sacraments. Okay, the Anglican Church, as I said, in colonial America is the default position. So the pale green here is where Anglicanism is on the ground, is the established religion. It will be the established religion in any colony unless the inhabitants make a fuss or assert themselves to the contrary. So the default religion in pre-revolutionary times is Anglicanism. The problem is this is a mile wide and an inch deep. It's there are, despite my encomium to Episcopal liturgy, there are a lot of people who are just going through this formally, who are just going to church on Sunday morning and repeating the words and going home. In fact, we have some dramatic accounts of Anglican worship in colonial Virginia, where the ordinary people are in the back pews, assembled in the back pews. The rector comes in, berobed, ascends to the pulpit, opens the book, recites the prayer I just recited, and then the big shots come into church. The swells, the planters, the plantation owners. They come in, and while the minister's going on, and occupy the front pews. And one of the main purposes of this entrance is to show off what you're wearing. Okay? The latest fashions from London, or better yet, from Paris. These pews are parceled out by something called pew rents. You raise the budget for the church by bidding out the different pews according to your financial contribution. The higher the contribution, the closer to the front. And so Master Barclay, big plantation owner, will come sashaying to the front with his arm candy and occupy the very front pew. She is dressed to the nines. He's all duded up like a real man, right? Silk breeches, beauty marks, powdered wigs. Manliness is a movable feast, fashion-wise, over the course of American history. So one great historian said of this that for the planters, or for Episcopalians or Anglicans, the Sunday morning was 1 hour of order. In other words, life of chaos and upheaval, with lots of drinking, lots of womenizing, lots of partying, lots of gambling. Would you bet the farm, literally, would you bet your plantation on which drop of rain is going to course to the bottom of the window pane first? Some planters did, because if you're not a real man, you have to be man enough to assert your place in the society, to run your plantation. And what's a man without courage? What's a man without judgment? And you demonstrate that with gambling. The horse race, Kentucky Derby. Kentucky is an extension of Virginia, Maryland. The Preakness in Baltimore. Horse racing, cockfighting, dog fighting, bear baiting, wrestling. All these competitive sports are attempts to show your place on the hierarchy of status. And also, yeah, the dancing after the party is over. When you cut in on the man because your favored lady is there, even though she doesn't know it yet, you'll persuade her. Life is a competition to be won by hedonistic competition. So on Sunday morning, we have an exception from that. And we have a period of order to reflect the transcendent order of things coming down to earth for a brief moment, to remind us that what this world is about. This historian continues and said, for evangelicals or for Baptists, it's just the opposite. You have a wild and crazy morning, Sunday morning, of ranting worship and spontaneous prayer and shouted singing, followed by a lifestyle, Monday through Saturday, a lifestyle of order and discipline, with no dancing, right? Dancing, standing up, all that. You've heard those jokes, those Baptist jokes. Okay. So the evangelicals are going to be a rebellion against this kind of religion, both theologically, liturgically, and in lifestyle. There are relatively, this map looks impressive, the wide sway of Anglicanism, but it is very thin on the ground because there are very few clergy. And the laity are pretty tepid. Not everybody in town is going to be in those pews on Sunday morning. By law, they should be, but by practice, they aren't. In New England towns, it's going to be different. Everybody will be there, or you will pay a fine. few clergy, tepid laity, and the whole thing depends on government privilege and sponsorship from London. But the Archbishop is far away, and you know, things can happen on the ground. Yeah. No, how's it different in New England? The Puritans. Yeah, yeah. 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 Well, Rhode Island how about Newport, Rhode Island? Rhode Island is different. The Puritans in Massachusetts called it the cesspool of New England, right? It's at the bottom where all the waste goes. Rhode Island, from Roger Williams on, the founder, is a place for all these dissenters. So there's, you know, you've seen the synagogue there, yeah? It's the old, yeah, the most beautiful synagogue in early America. Baptist, anybody, you know, people of any faith can settle there and be tolerated. And the Anglicans as well. I'll get to this in a minute, but the radical step comes when the Anglicans come into Boston by royal edict. And that's when it hits the fan. But yeah, Newport, Providence, of course, crazy stuff is going to happen down there. I mean, that's where all the, okay. That's where all the bad people in New England go. It's also the center of the American slave trade. Brown University is founded on the donations of one of the biggest slave trading families in early America. And all the Ivy League institutions, including Yale, are trying to come to terms with how much of their foundation is built with enslaved labor, blood, and monetary proceeds. I think Brown has a worse problem than any of them. Okay, other questions right now? That's Anglicanism, generally speaking. It has its merits. It has its difficulties, and its defects. Every option does. The Puritans also, and the Dutch Reformed, and the Presbyterians. And the virtues and the defects tend to come flying together. Double helix DNA. It's the right at the heart of religion. Okay, and I'm going to briefly review what Anglicanism was like in the different sections. In the South, it was the established religion. If you've ever been to Williamsburg, you've doubtless gone into the Bruton Parish. You can see Thomas Jefferson's pew. You don't see Thomas Jefferson's Bible, right? Old Testament removed, epistles removed, and all the reports of Jesus' miracles cut out. You don't have his Bible, but you know, George Washington was a member of the vestry, the ruling committee of his neighborhood, the ruling board. And he showed up Sunday mornings, but he typically absented himself before the sacrament. Religion for the leadership was about setting a good example of moral order and proper behavior for the lesser folks. And so anyone who aspired to leadership in the colony would, of course, be a member of the parish, local parish, and have a pew in the capital. Chesapeake society, remember, is the Chesapeake area is the region that grew fastest and came to be the most numerous. But it took them a while to get there. Chesapeake society is characterized by a geography of rivers that go into the interior. If you look at a map of early New England, colonial New England, you'll see towns all over the place. In colonial Virginia, you don't see towns, you see plantations scattered along rivers. And the really good ones, good valuable frontage is on the parts of the rivers that can harbor or host ocean-going ships. Because then you can roll your tobacco right down the wharf onto the ship, and you don't need a middleman. Towns are all about middlemen, okay? The big planters down here became the middlemen for their neighbors. Anyway, this is a geography that encourages dispersal. Everybody wants to have their place along the river. This is also a heavily male region. There's not natural increase here until 1680. It's only in 1680 that you get to the 3 male to 2 female ratio that generates natural increase. This is an immigrant society, and it appeals to single young men, which is not a formula for a law-abiding, stable order, right? If you want an analogy here, I would give you the gold rush. It's young, hungry men betting their lives on going to a wilderness and making their fortune there. And it's a bet that most of them lost. So if you would add up the number of immigrants to Virginia by 1645, 1650, you would find only half of that number in the actual population. This is young men were betting their lives, and half of them were losing. So a mining camp atmosphere with high mortality and material, not spiritual priorities. So whatever the charter of Virginia said about this being an outpost of true religion, and everybody has to go to church and pay attention to the rector and obey the word of God, the actualities on the ground were very different. That's because of the economy. Virginia and Maryland are export-oriented plantations. They're looking for gold at first along the James River, and that didn't work out. They started importing silkworms because that was a high valuable product. And then it was too cold for sugar. Cotton required far too much labor. So finally they came upon brown gold, tobacco. Tobacco is very wearing on the soil. So it requires more and more acquisition of more and more land. And it's pretty tedious, arduous work. It's not killing work like sugarcane fields, but you're working 12 months a year, fairly tediously. And if you wanted to just work your own land and survive, you could have stayed in the old country. You came here to get rich. And the way to do that is to have other people do the heavy lifting for you. So this is a bond labor society, not a free labor society. Most of the labor until 1660 is white indentured servants, right? Poor guys with not much of a chance back home, who are willing to bet their life to survive 4, 5, 6 years until they could pay off their indenture, get their own land, bring that into tillage. Oh, it's forested. I'm going to have to cut down all these trees before I can plant a crop. Okay, this is a very high risk kind of venture. And the type of bonded labor shifts over with the founding of the Royal Africa Company in the 1670s to enslaved Africans. Again, this is not a formula for zealous piety and high morality. In the lower South, let's say in Carolinas and Georgia, we have enslaved labor, African labor from the start, because they've learned from their fathers and grandfathers in Barbados how to do this. Only here you can't plant sugar, you plant rice and indigo. And if you've ever been to the rice plantations around Charleston, you see how intricate a system this is. It's not that English guys knew how to do this. It was West Africans that knew how to do this. They had the technology, the intellectual property, if you will, for raising rice, and they dug the rice paddies, and it involved removing, handling more soil than went into the building of the pyramids. This is an incredibly labor-intensive industry, rice. By 1730, there's a Black majority in South Carolina. It's the only colony of which that was true. It took a while to get going, but once it got going, it really took off. Again, the purple stripe, the purple band in this map is the Chesapeake. African-American enslaved labor over here in the Chesapeake, and the lower South taking off a slight delay. Very high investment of life and money and labor, and it takes a while to pay off, but once it does, the region really starts to prosper. Notice the very minuscule role of enslaved African-American labor in New England and in the Middle Colonies. Most of this blue line represents people living in cities. So the heavy lifting in New York and Pennsylvania occurred on the wharves of New York City and Philadelphia. The time of the Revolution, about 20% of New York City's population was enslaved Africans. Yeah. So you would not see them in the countryside so much, although they did creep up the Hudson Valley. Sojourner Truth, Isabella Hardenberg, by birth, was born under slavery outside Poughkeepsie, I think. Her native language was kind of a Anglo-Dutch dialect. But by and large, slavery in the Middle Colonies is located in the harbor cities. These are not, again, formulas for vital, ardent religion. Every colonial region in early America had what I call its own social shape. In New England, it's going to be a circle. In the Middle Colonies, it's a patchwork quilt. In the backcountry, it's sort of a scattergram. In the Chesapeake, it's a hierarchy. The big planters occupy the top 5%. Independent farmers with their own land and their own tools and so forth occupy the next 30 or so percent. Then we get tenant farmers, white tenant farmers, and about 40% on the bottom is enslaved African laborers. These people, the guys on top, are going to control the church, lay trustees. It's not the bishop that runs things. The rector, the local minister, is under the power of these big planters. There are few clergy and a fairly meager quality. This is not the kind of life that an ordinary Oxford graduate is going to want to pursue. And again, the religion is a mile wide and an inch deep. In other words, the American South, both the Chesapeake and the Lower South, are a mission field. And in 1701, a missionary society is formed back in England, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, SPG, to send missionaries over to this heathen land. How different are things from our own time? The South is the least religious section in the country. The most religious section of the country is New England, and it's not Catholic like it is today. New England is the site of ardent religion. The South is heathendom with a thin veneer of some Anglican practice. It's a mission field. Brothers and sisters, won't you contribute money to send missionaries to this savage land? And here we are, here's the missionary. holding the book, yeah, True Religion. And we have people wishful thinking. We have native people here that say white people welcoming the good news of the gospel over the choppy sea. Not really. This is one of the most interesting emissaries of the SPG, George Keith. He starts out in Philadelphia as a Quaker and converts to Anglicanism. So did William Penn's sons. We'll see that Quakerism is a hard way to organize a society. We want order. We want prescribed rules. You shouldn't look to Quakers for that. Look to Quakers for other things. You look to Anglicans and law books to run a colony. So Keith is not unusual in converting from the Friends to the Anglicans, but he is one of the main proponents and workers in this SPG. From 1700, when it's formed, until the eve of the American Revolution, the SPG sends over 300 clergy to America to bring the good news of the gospel, again, to what is perceived to be a barbarous and heathen land. Maybe some things about the South haven't changed. I don't know. Anglicanism in the Middle Colonies is a different thing. Here we have a picture of Christ Church in Philadelphia. Our daughter, when she was a graduate student at UPenn, sang in the choir here. It was really interesting venue. We think of Anglican churches as having a lot of stained glass and so forth, but this is bright and open pane glass. It's a very light yet posh interior, okay? And this is the richest church in America, Trinity Church, right off Wall Street, because it owns Wall Street. It owns most of Lower Manhattan, which is fairly valuable property, right? Every Anglican church got glebe lands, that is, got a certain amount of land by royal decree to generate income to support the rector. The glebe lands of Trinity Church are, I think, the most valuable property in the United States. So if you want to run a church on the endowment, this is your model. Okay. After 1664, Anglicanism becomes the established religion of New Netherland, now New York. The Dutch Reform, Dutch language remains around for the over 100 years to come. But if you want to get ahead in society, it's probably a wise move to join the Anglican Church. And similarly in Philadelphia. Now the Quakers, one of the great problems is they get pretty rich. How can you live by the Holy Spirit when you have so much income? That's their own challenge, and they'll face it. But the other, so Quakers are one establishment, but there are people who don't like the Quakers and people who come from other places, like from Boston, like Benjamin Franklin, who want to have their own pillar, their own channel of advancement. And these guys will tend to hang around the Anglican Church. So Anglicanism in the Middle Colonies tends to be the religion of the ruling class, or a rival ruling class in Philadelphia, rival to the Quakers in New York, rival to the Dutch. And they put up structures that speak this message, right? Anglicanism in New England is maybe the most interesting, because we have on the left King's Chapel, eventually North Church in Boston, which is not an inspiring example of church architecture. I don't know what they had in mind. And on the right, we have Trinity Church on the New Haven Green. I would pass by this on the way to the bank every other Friday when I got my stipend check to get off the rice and beans for another day. Anglicanism in New England is a choice, a dissenting choice, because the establishment in New England is Puritan. King's Chapel is instituted as part of the constitutional change, the change to the charter in Massachusetts in the 1680s. The king requires that there be true worship, that is, say, Anglican worship in the city. And so he sponsors the building of this church. And so it's a church that will attract people who are on the outs with the Puritan establishment, or again, want to create a rival establishment. In Connecticut, Anglicanism spreads through the countryside as well as in the big cities. So by 1775, there are 40 Episcopal churches with 20 clergy, which is not a bad ratio. It's better than what you have in the South. But this is a religion of intentional converts. Kind of interesting, because we usually think of Baptists and Methodists and Evangelicals as based on conversion. The Episcopalians or the Anglicans in New England are converts away from Puritanism and converts away from Evangelicalism. The most shocking incidence of converts is at Yale in 1722, when the entire faculty, all three of them, quit the Congregational church and joined the Anglican church. It was a thunderclap. Fairly soon, the young graduate student, Jonathan Edwards, will fill one of those spots before he goes on to other ventures. So Anglicanism everywhere is the establishment, but in New England, it's the site of the gathering site of the dissenters. In fact, Trinity Church on the New Haven Green is one of three churches facing the green. There's the Center Church, which is the original Congregational church. As you're facing that, to the right is the Congregational church that's born out of the Great Awakening. That's the hoopla church. That's the rock and roll church. That's where you have the Holy Spirit rolling on the floor, at least for a while. They're New Englanders. They get order pretty soon. But on the left is Trinity Church, which is the equal and opposite reaction to the Great Awakening. So Poor Center Church is split. Some of its people get born again and go to the church, the evangelical church on the right. Others are appalled at what revival services entail. They want decency and good order. They want sober delight and rational exaltation, and they go to Trinity Church. So Anglicanism in the North over time becomes less an established church and more growing by voluntary support. It is the harbor for people who protest, who are discontented with the Puritan establishment and the evangelical revivalist reaction to that establishment. Most of the Anglicans in the South, like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, will be ardent patriots at the time of the Revolution. The Anglicans in the North tend very much to be loyalists, aka Tories. They believe that an orderly society requires an established church. They'd ask the patriots, what don't you understand about Romans 13, verse 1? Let every soul be obedient to the higher powers, because the powers that be are of God. They think the American Revolution is going to unleash chaos and disorder and will come to no good. You have to have one king and one church, the prescribed church. And so Anglicanism in New England especially is strongly associated with loyalism and can barely survive the American Revolution. We have a little waterboarding example here in the middle of the screen. These are patriots, you see the noose above them. You see Liberty Tree on the tree behind them. This is the Patriot site. And they are giving the water torture to a suspected loyalist, making him confess that he's a Tory, or perhaps ratting out his fellow believers. And you see the water spilling out. Alas, waterboarding was not invented in the Iraq invasion. It's an old one. The first bishop of the newly independent Episcopal Church in the newly independent United States is Samuel Seabury, a good Connecticut boy. So the challenge for the Episcopal Church going forward after the American Revolution is how to generate or display your American bona fides. Are you not emissary of a foreign faith, of menacing Great Britain? So they have to show their American bona fides. And that'll start happening by the 1820s and the 1830s with Christmas carols and the cult of Santa Claus. So our whole way of experiencing and celebrating Christmas is a high church Anglican Episcopal invention that comes from sons of loyalist pastors and loyalist officers in New York City. And this becomes the great American holiday. One thing that happens when you discover when you study religion is that God has a wicked sense of humor. And, so it's in kind of folk customs and popular culture that Episcopalianism starts to win its way back. The Night Before Christmas was written by a professor at General Theological Seminary, the Episcopal Seminary in New York. One of the richest men in New York City. Again, his father was an ardent loyalist. He writes The Night Before Christmas, and eventually that will marry up with the Christmas Carol coming from England, and Christmas cards popularized by Queen Victoria at the same time to give us our high holy day. Well, Super Bowl Sunday is our real high holy day, but Christmas is a pretty good second. Okay, that's enough of me. Questions, comments?
It seems like there's been some reference to slavery. Was this an accepted something in all these churches?
Yeah,
Okay.
it was. I mean, the short answer, unfortunately, is yes. The first true descent from the slave trade was objected to before slavery itself, came from Quakers. And the Quakers also became the first anti-slavery church. So you could not be, by the time of the American Revolution, shortly after, you could not be a friend in good standing and own other human beings. There were some Puritans, Jonathan Edwards' son, for instance, and most interestingly, one of the judges at Salem who repented of what he had done and wrote a profound apology to his parishioners over what he had done. His next tract was a protest against the slave trade. But this is, these dissenting voices are pretty thin on the ground because the South is the prosperous section of the country, right? That's where the balance of payments are made, right? Shipping tobacco and rice to the old country in exchange for manufactured goods. You can't kill the golden goose. Yet as time went on, tobacco agriculture so impoverished the soil of Virginia and Maryland that some planters gave it up, like George Washington gave up growing tobacco. He still had enslaved laborers, and if you go to if you go to Mount Vernon, you'll see the testimony to the importance of slavery in the backyard. But there was a hope, and Tom, I think this was Jefferson too. There was a hope that slavery would become uneconomical and go away. And his correspondent asked Jefferson, well, what then would you do with the former slaves? Oh, we're going to have to ship them out of here because blacks and whites cannot live peaceably together. We're going to import good English people instead. So that expectation, that hope, and the three churches, the Methodists, the Baptists, and the Presbyterians, all passed edicts in the early 1800s condemning slavery and saying that has to be done away with. But then a great Connecticut Yankee, Eli Whitney, invented a cotton gin. I used to pass, walking into campus every day, I used to pass Eli Whitney's gun manufacturing shop. He first started with firearms, yeah, and then he went to the cotton gin along Whitney Avenue, one of the major arteries in New Haven. This descendant of the Puritans invented the machine that gave a new birth to slavery because the cotton gin made cotton production economically viable. It was too labor intensive before because you had to pick all the seeds out, right? Now you have a machine to do that. So this expectation that slavery would somehow fade away, that expectation faded away. And then the fat will be in the fire because abolitionism spreads gradually across the North. But that's for next course. Somebody else.
I think sometimes we think of New England as a place with a church on every corner and a minister in every church. And you made clear how untrue that was, that a good ratio would be half enough ministers for the number of churches.
Well, that's true of the Anglican Church. For the Puritans, the congregation, they had a pastor. It was very typical for them to have a pastor.
Okay. So in 1664, when Peter Stuyvesant hands over the keys to New Netherland, at that time there were 4 and only 4 Reformed ministers in the colony. And 2 of them quickly left. And there were 13 churches in the entire New Netherland.
Yeah.
So, I mean, New England just dwarfed it in population, of course. But that is really surprising to most people that we think of the Reformed Church being so important, as you said, in the history of the colonial times, when you've only got 13 churches and most of them can't afford a minister at all at the time that New Netherland becomes part of England.
Yeah. New England is different because you mint the ministers on site. It's called Harvard. Okay, Harvard was begun to provide ministers for every town. So the statutes of every town said there has to be a church with a minister and there has to be a school. And everybody will be taxed for the support thereof. This is Puritans are.
Okay, so they had a state church. And the Reformed Church, I wonder if you can say the Reformed Church was never a state church at all in this side of the, maybe it wasn't in the Netherlands either, but it was never a state church.
It was not the state church in the Netherlands anywhere either. It was the national church. It was the only allowable public church. But in New Netherland, it had to be funded by the Dutch West Indies Company, which, you know, wanted to put its profits elsewhere. And the Dutch West Indies Company did not enforce that exclusiveness. So you had a Jewish congregation, in fact, on the ground. You had all sorts of things. You had who was the observer, or when was that? He said you walk up and down the streets of New York and you hear 13 different languages, and there are probably 13 different churches as well. But Yeah, they were mostly hand to mouth, including the supposedly established one. So that's why one reason, what you talked about, the paucity of ministers is also true of the South. That's why what makes New England such an exception and not the rule. One more? Come on, don't you all sit there passively like Calvin students? You know, give me a question. Yeah.
Did anybody else have a question? A minute, I'll need to sit here and know what the questions. Okay. So the training of ministers also would be almost non-existent for some of the ministers that would be in the colonies.
Yeah.
In that time.
Yeah.
If they can't get somebody from the better institutions back home, whether it's England or the Netherlands, who wants to cross the ocean and
Yeah.
live in those circumstances if they can get anything at home?
And who wants to take the risk, New York City boy, of taking a voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, which is pretty risky,
Okay,
studying in Utrecht for 3 years and then coming back?
so they're taking whoever the Dutch West India Company's taking, whoever they can get.
Uh-huh.
And they'll call them a chaplain so they can water down what you have to know or do to be this. So now you have somebody who's a chaplain, but he has just whatever training he could pick up in the Netherlands. Maybe he's the equivalent of a high school graduate, maybe not.
Mhm.
He's supposed to be able to speak well. He's supposed to be able to comfort people from a book of prayers and things that he can use, but he has not been trained as a minister the way we would think of it.
Yeah.
And he comes and now his paycheck is not coming from the Dutch West India Company because it didn't come last month. He's reliant on some way to charge the people.
Mhm.
Now he's responsive to his congregation.
Uh-huh.
Whose wishes and desires is he going to listen to? And whose understanding of what religion is he going to be responsive to?
Yeah.
The people looking him in the face, whether it's 20 people or 50, or whether he can gather more than that. So you have a more lay-driven church than almost anywhere else in England or the United States for whatever it is.
Yeah. And in Virginia, these are the people that he's going to be responsible to, because this is the vestry, the top 5%, right? The big landowners.
But in the South, but maybe that's not true in New Netherland, but maybe it is.
Well, I think, yeah, some people in the local church in New York City or in Jersey or in Brooklyn are going to be maybe more frequent with their donations and therefore more listened to.
Correct. Whoever gives,
Money-
wherever your money is coming from, that's
money
what you're going to
talks.
listen to.
Yeah, money
So-
talks.
But we had a class recently in religion here by Stephen Stagg, who's doing a lot of new work.
Oh, yeah.
You probably have
Yeah.
run across.
Steve is a student of mine.
And he's pointing out that Peter Stuyvesant was a huge slave owner. Don't be thinking that he was some country boy from the Netherlands whose father was a Dutch Reformed minister, therefore he had ideas of the humanity of man. Forget that. Peter Stuyvesant was very big in making his own fortune in the slave trade. And so were just about every family you can think of that has an old Dutch name well planted in the colonies. Yeah, of New Netherland. I mean, it was much bigger than I had previously ever understood.
Well, the main interest of the Dutch West Indies Company is in the West Indies, right? With the sugar plantations, and they were supplying enslaved Africans to the English colonies before 1670, when King Charles II says, "Why are they dominating this lucrative trade? We got to get our oar in."
And Peter Stuyvesant looks around and notices, well, my colonists are asking more slaves than the Dutch West India Company is going to send here because we're not a colony that's in the black for them.
Yeah,
So they're not going to give us the allocation of slaves we'd like to have. So actually, fortunately for New Netherland, they never acquired such a substantial population
Yeah,
of slave
yeah.
labor that
yeah.
that you might
The
expect.
it's
There were only
interesting.
300 slaves in the colony in 1664 out of 2,000 people. So I don't know, that's about 15%, I think, of the population. And So in other words, they had a lot of slaves, but not a lot in the whole
Right.
picture that you're showing. Because as you pointed out, only 5% of the Dutch West India slaves ever came to the American colonies at
Yeah.
all. I think
Yeah.
you said that.
Yeah.
I think we have another
Okay,
question. back
good.
here.
I'm sorry. I didn't want to
Okay.
go on, but you didn't have any questions, so I gave you one.
So was there somebody back here that had their hand up? Thank you.
I don't know if this is a question or not, but was there any evidence of Christian nationalism thinking during this period?
Uh-huh. Well, there certainly was in New England, which called itself God's New Israel, right? I mean, they very literally thought they were replicating the deliverance of God's chosen people from Egypt, called England, across the Red Sea, expanded to a foreign shore, a Canaan, where they were to create Zion and be God's, do it right this time. Very much their charter was Old Testament, right? They were thought that this was the model, the biblical model for creating a righteous society. Unfortunately, they did to the native peoples what the Hebrews, per divine command, did to the Canaanites, right? So the Indians were the Canaanites, and they were very deliberately, explicitly replicating that model. On the other hand, they did not believe in cheap grace. So one of the most famous speeches to come out of Puritan New England is John Winthrop's model of Christian charity, kind of the founding document. That's where in the very last paragraph, you get the city on the hill thing, right? But if you read that document, it goes for about 11 pages. 9 of the pages are about economics. How do we establish a godly society? Only when, to quote, paraphrase him, when we are willing to sacrifice our luxuries for our neighbor's necessities. So economic equity was key to this model. And the city on the hill essentially meant, boys and girls, there's going to be an exam in this course, and we jolly well might fail it. And the eyes of the world are upon us to see if we are up to this. Not the whole world wants to come here. No, the world is looking at us, expecting us to fail, to become a colony like any other. We have to be a righteous society. So there's some noble standards here, and there's some very telling temptations. Because anytime you think you're the chosen people, right? You can take that to self-praise and smugness. That's what makes, to me, the history of New England so interesting. You have this tension baked in from the start. We'll see a kind of Christian nationalism later, especially with the wars against France. So Britain enters into a 30-year war, 25-year war with France, beginning in 1688. Lasting through 1715. Britain and France are chronically at war. And that's when Puritans especially, but all the others in America as well, start to really discover themselves as British and own themselves. What makes you a Briton? You're a Protestant. The French are Catholics, and they're the Antichrist. So British Protestant nationalism, we could call it. And we are proud to be part of the British Empire. And we want to be more of the British Empire. This lasts a long time. Benjamin Franklin is the emissary from Pennsylvania, very prosperous colony by his age, his middle age. He's an emissary to England to try to get the king, to try to get Pennsylvania's charter revoked so that it might become a royal colony. he wants a closer tie to the king. So this whole notion of an independent America dawns very, very late and gets the assent of only about 40% of the people. Patriots are about 40%. So there's this original Puritan God's New Israel model that has some analogies. And then there's this idea of being part of a larger Protestant British Empire over against the French Antichrist.
I think this will need to be the last question, because that clock's a little fast, but we're about out of time.
How did the idea of separation of church and state enter into that? Because it, at least in my understanding, there was an effort to get away from that on the part of people that were coming to the United States.
Only to a couple colonies. So Rhode Island had no established religion. Separation of church and state was a phrase that came out only around early 1800s, right? In a letter from Jefferson to some Baptists, his greatest fans. So there was no established religion in Rhode Island, and there was no established religion in Pennsylvania. Every other colony had an established church. And so the whole notion of separation of church and state comes up only after the Revolution, in the time of the Constitution, where we now have 14 states that are trying to come together to make a union. Well, if there's going to be an established church, which one? Anglican, Presbyterian, Congregational, what? And they said, on the federal level, none. That did not apply on the state level. So states in the new nation up to 1820s, many states still had a tax-supported church, an established church, if you will. They all had allowed religious pluralism. So you didn't have to be a member of this church to be a resident here, a citizen here, but there was one publicly supported church in many states. The last one to depart from that was Massachusetts in 1833. It's only in 1834 that you can say that there's no state-supported church, but there are all kinds of public supports for churches, particularly in the educational system. It's separation of church and state becomes prevailing constitutional doctrine really only in during World War II with a Supreme Court edict to that effect.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you all will join me in thanking our speaker today, and we look forward to seeing you.
Thank you.